I'm not sure like what you're allowed to say or not allowed to say, or what you're comfortable saying or not saying, but just out there purely as a comic book fan, again, what do you think of James Gunn taking over DC?
Like one of the mistakes I think DC made with Dark Knight. So it's like, ooh, dark. So now Superman's got to be dark, and this has got to be dark. And it's like, no, Dark Knight is dark. Superman is, optimistic or positive. The Flash is light, whatever. And I think Gunn is a better fit in helping each of them find the tone that fits that property.
Is James Gunn the right guy for the DC universe? And why exactly did some of those Fantastic Four movies not quite hit the spot? Well, these are just two of the questions that I discuss with one of Hollywood's leading makeup and prosthetics designers. Now, you might be asking yourself, what exactly does a movie makeup designer know about comic books? Well, let me tell you this. This particular movie makeup legend has not only worked on some of the biggest superhero movies ever, including Ironman, The Guardians of the Galaxy, and Men in Black 3, he is also a comic book enthusiast. In fact, that is a complete and utter understatement. He's not just a comic book enthusiast. He is like an entire library of superhero encyclopedias, comic books, and graphic novels, all rolled into the form of one man, Bart Mixon. Now, I know that some of you comic book fans out there are a little bit more discerning as to what constitutes as a great makeup artist. Well, trust me, Bart Mixon can do the comic book thing, but he can certainly do the monster thing too, having worked on some of the genre's most iconic faces. Leatherface, Michael Myers, Freddy Krueger. And if that's still not enough, Bart Mixon helped create the look of horror's most famous clown, Pennywise, in the now iconic and legendary 90s miniseries It. So whether you're into superheroes or monsters, you're in safe hands with the great Bart Mixon. So bite that subscribe button and be sure to keep an eye on the space, because over the next few weeks, we're going to find out a lot about Bart Mixon and his absolutely legendary run as a leading Hollywood movie makeup and prosthetics artist. Maybe we'll also find out if this legendary movie makeup artist by day is something entirely different by night. Monster or superhero?
I love your room. It looks a little bit like mine.
I was going to say, I hope it's not too cluttered, but then I see it's very similar. So, very good.
Ant-Man, Guardians, Thor, Star Trek, RoboCop, Zombieland, The Avengers. I mean, holy cow, that is like, if you could compile a list of greatest movies, so many of your films would be there. Go, how does a guy, a young buck all the way from Houston, Texas, blast into Hollywood and, end up with a movie list like that?
Right. Well, it's I guess a lot of it is certainly a lot of it's just luck. And it's, I think probably comes back to ultimately to who you know to at least some degree. I mean, I was lucky. Like I said, I grew up in Houston, Texas. I was dabbling with the makeup effects, as a fan. I belonged to a comic book club in Houston in the early 70s. And there was another member, Ken Donnell, who used some super basic stuff. And most of it probably wasn't even the right way to do it. But at least he kind of like showed me how to make a mold or some real rudimentary, stuff. But through that convention, or the comic book scene, they put on local conventions, and Rick Baker was a guest there. In 1977, Star Wars had just come out, and I'd been a fan of his work since reading about him in Famous Monsters, like around 1971. Like they had an article when Schlock, was in production, and the Dino Kong, which as a fan of the original Kong, I hated the Dino remake in 76, but Rick's work was obviously very good. Even though he got screwed out of an Oscar on that, they gave it to Carlo Imbaldi. It should have been, Rick should have been on the ticket, if not, the only person. But I met Rick at this convention, and then he gave me his contact information. So, we stayed in touch. And I'd also met Greg Jean, who did like the models in Close Encounters. And while I was in LA, I would just hit I'd go by Tom Berman's, I'd go by David Allen's, So basically I was just, a fan, or at least we're called monster kids now, those of us that grew up in the 60s. So, I mean, I was just doing it as a fan, and then eventually I had another friend in Dallas, Ernie Farino, who moved out to LA, and I guess I must have sent him just some samples of work. So I think Ernie had an assortment of my samples. So when they were looking for additional help on a show called Forbidden World in 1981, Ernie must have shown my work to John Beekler, who was the department head for the effects makeup on the show. And then I got a call to come out for a week and work on that. So that was like my first, Hollywood, movie. I think the big takeaway, at least, is, I mean, I started as a fan. I've been a Marvel Comics fan since, I was 5 or 6 years old. Spider-Man #6 is the first comic book I ever bought, or at least first superhero book. And that got me into this comic book club that introduced me to the world of conventions, that introduced me to people like Rick Baker and Ernie Farino. And then I was able to, parlay that into eventual work.
So am I right in my understanding? So Rick Baker basically ushered you into the world of makeup in a sense?
Well, he was helpful and that's kind of, again, getting back to the who you know thing. Like I went out and visited him in 1978. Me and I've got a twin brother who did roto effects on like the Terminator films and other projects, Coppola's Dracula. So my brother and I and a couple of other friends would go out and again visit Rick and whoever. I don't know if he was just trying to get rid of us or if he, he knew that we were interested. So he gave us Rob Bottin's, phone number and address. He's like, here, you ought to go visit Rob while you're out here. So I met Rob on that same trip. And then 8 years later, Rob just called me out of the blue to work on RoboCop. So had I not met Rob 8 years before, he wouldn't have known that there was this guy in Texas and they were shooting RoboCop in Dallas. I was in Houston. So when the need came up for them to, they're either replacing a member of the Robo team or else they just needed to add another person. And Rob's like, well, I know this guy Bart, in Houston. So, and again, had Rick not made that introduction, I doubt Rob would have even known who I was. So, I mean, eventually when I did move out to LA, after I worked on RoboCop in '86 while I was still in Houston, we did some additional photography in early '87. And then I decided to move out to LA after that. I figured, I'm not going to have a better, calling card, I guess, than having just worked on RoboCop. So when I did move to LA in March, I think within 2 weeks, I was working at Rick Baker's shop on Gorillas in the Mist. He was certainly there when I needed him. I never really pushed it in terms of like, come on, Rick, give me work, but it's like, hey, I just moved out here. You need any help? Yeah, sure, come on. And then like shortly after that was '87 on Gorillas in the Mist. Then when he did Gremlins 2 in '88, he hired me as his shop foreman. So I was coordinating and pretty much running the shop for him. He's been lurking in the shadows, if not being a major player. But then I was fortunate enough to certainly do a number of shows, for Rick, the last one being Men in Black 3, which, I got to apply the main character. I did Jermaine Clement's application for, Boris the Animal. So my fan dream came true in terms of getting to apply, a Rick Baker character, like the main character for that movie. It's been a wonderful life,
Yeah.
Particularly because, again, I'm a fan. I'm a comic book fan, as you can tell. I'm a monster fan. So getting to work on like Marvel movies and, doing like my favorite, Marvel characters and then getting to work, Rick Baker was my all-time favorite, makeup effects guy. So getting to be a key member of his team on a number of projects and culminating and getting to do, the main villain for what turned out to be his next to the last movie, his last big movie.
You mentioned being a Marvel fan. Is there a particular storyline or is there a particular comic that kind of stands for you above the rest, one that resonated with you particularly?
Well, I guess more accurately, I'm a Jack Kirby fan.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I don't want to get into the whole, Stan versus Jack kind of thing, but I think anybody that looks at what happened from 1940 to 1970 knows that Jack Kirby was the main creative force behind all that. Stan Lee was a great editor, and he knew when to say, yes, that's a good idea, Jack, do that. But I mean, obviously the Fantastic Four and all that stuff was Kirby's idea. It wasn't, I don't buy any of this. I was watching a fly crawling on the wall, nonsense from Stan. But anyway, so Jack Kirby was my favorite. The Fantastic Four, I think the Stan and Jack years on the FF 1 through 101, it was the world's greatest comic magazine. So, particularly when Joe Sinnott started inking Kirby, that was just, you can't get any better than that. So I'm hoping when Marvel finally gets around to doing their Fantastic Four. I mean, I worked on the Michael Chiklis, Fox one, which was okay for its time, and had it had a bigger budget, I think it could have been a better movie. The 2015 one I just thought was horrible.
What did you find horrible about it?
You name it. they everywhere from I didn't like the young fantastic, I guess it was mainly the Ultimate Fantastic Four. I didn't like them all being young. I didn't like what they did with Doctor Doom. They spent too much time before they got their powers. The only thing I did like about it was I liked linking their powers to the negative zone. I thought that was a nice twist and a decent updating. Because I mean, if there's one fault with the original origin story, I guess, if Reed was the smartest man in the world, he should have foreseen the cosmic ray perils. But are you much of a comic fan?
Yes.
Did you get the Heroes Reborn series that Jim Lee did?
Tell me about it.
The one thing, I mean, basically it was just kind of a rehashing of like key, because they only did it for 12 issues or maybe 13. So it was like, okay, here's when they met Submariner, and so it was just kind of a retelling of like key story points, throughout basically the Kirby run. But the one thing that I thought the new thing that they added that I thought made sense was their explanation for the origin of the Fantastic Four was the cosmic radiation that gives them their powers was residual radiation from Galactus, like teleporting into our part of the galaxy. So it was something that Reed could not have foreseen, because it was this total random, they're just out in space doing whatever and everything's going fine, and then suddenly, unbeknownst to them, Galactus appears light years away, but just some residual radiation from him coming into our part of the universe is what gave them their powers, which I thought was kind of neat. So I'm hoping when Marvel does theirs, maybe they'll take that plot point and use that as the catalyst for what gave them their powers. Because him just going like, I didn't think of putting shields on the ship, 1961, okay, I'd buy that, but not now. I have heard some rumors that supposedly a lot of the art direction for like The Thing and Galactus and stuff like that is supposed to be very true to like the Kirby Sinnott era, of the Fantastic Four. So if we get a thing, it'll obviously be digital. If we get a CGI thing that looks like say the Thing, the way he looked on the cover of This Man, This Monster, Fantastic Four 51. Yeah, but if we get something that looks like the Kirby Sinnott thing, I'll die a happy man. With Marvel finally doing it, Kevin Feige and all that, I think we're going to get something closer just to the feel of what Kirby did with Lee back in the 60s, because that hasn't been done. I know some people probably say like, well, the Michael Chiklis Fantastic Fours were that Fantastic Four, and it's like, no, it wasn't. And particularly the characterization of Reed. Reed should not be a nerd. He should be like a two-fisted, man's man. He should be as confident, with his fists as he is with his mind, and from the one I worked on, I think he could have been a good Reed had they just written him better. Right. It's kind of like who played Cyclops in the original X-Men's, James Marsden.
That's I think so. I can't recall exactly.
Anyway, but he comes off rather bland in the X-Men movies, but then you see him in anything else that he's done just as an actor, and you're like, wow, that guy's good. And then you realize that it was just the way they wrote his character and maybe the way they directed him. Like Cyclops could have been a cool character in the first run of the X-Men, but it's just they didn't write him, as well as they should. So similarly, I didn't like the way they handled Reed in the first in the FFs that I worked on.
Okay.
I think by trying to, Stan wasn't real good with his female characterization back in the 60s. So I think by them rightfully trying to make Sue Storm a relevant character, it's like they brought Reed down, and it's like, just leave Reed up here and bring Sue up to his level. You don't need to take him down to build her up.
It's quite amazing to me that you're this Marvel fan, and you had the opportunity to work on all of these movies. Now, you spoke about the Fantastic Four, you feeling that it didn't quite hit the nail on the head. Which of the Marvel movies are you, as a comic book fan, particularly happy with, whether or not you worked on it?
Yeah, and that's certainly not a criteria. I mean, the prior to the MCU, certainly the Raimi Spider-Mans, and particularly Spider-Man 2, I thought they really got right. I thought X-Men 2 was good. I mean, I didn't like Spider-Man 3, but that's because, Sony made him shove Venom in there, which, Spider-Man 3 should have been they should have set Venom up to be the villain in 4. But once you got into MCU and Kevin Feige steering the ship, I mean, certainly the first Iron Man, I think Iron Man 2 is better than a lot of people say it is. Captain America, Winter Soldier probably set the bar very high. The first Avengers, certainly, I think probably Captain America as a franchise has probably been the best. I think both the first Captain America, First Avenger, Winter Soldier, and Civil War, I think are all at a pretty consistent level. But whereas some of the others, are kind of more up and down. The last Thor wasn't as good as Ragnarok. The Guardians franchise, I think Guardians has been a pretty consistent, across the board. I think those have all been at a good, level of quality. Even the ones that I may have been a little disappointed with, there were things in it that usually there's something in there that I like. And some of that might just be because I'm admitted I'm a little biased. I am a Marvel fan. Like, I just saw The Flash and I was kind of like, yeah, it's cool seeing Keaton again. And I'm probably more critical of like the DC stuff than I am with the Marvel stuff, just because it's like, well, I'm a Marvel guy, so I'm willing to cut him some slack. I was like disappointed like with the Eternals, which I was really looking forward to that, because that was like the first one that was completely a Jack Kirby project. There's no argument as to who created that. It's Kirby, but then they deviated like so wildly from his core concepts on that it's like, well, maybe that's one of the reasons why it didn't do so good.
I'm not sure like what you're allowed to say or not allowed to say, or what you're comfortable saying or not saying, but just out there purely as a comic book fan, again, what do you think of James Gunn taking over DC? It's quite clear that DC needs something to happen if they want to keep up there.
Probably the biggest thing that Disney did, biggest mistake they made, was firing him originally, which opened the door for him to do Suicide Squad and led to this whole thing. So I think finally DC is going to be able to give Marvel some competition. I think the one thing that DC's been lacking is they haven't had a Kevin Feige. And even though Kevin's not a director and the producer, but at least he's been like a consistent vision. He's been the arbiter, or the kind of the last word on. So all their stuff's been under one creative umbrella. Whereas DC, you had like, we got the Nolan Batman. But that doesn't really tie into the Snyder Superman. They've not had any cohesive vision, and I don't know that they've been able to attract anyone to do that. Like, I know they wanted Nolan to kind of steer the DC universe, but he's like, no, I'd rather go make Oppenheimer and whatever. Yeah. I think now at least they have the potential. I think I'm more impressed with Gunn as a choice than I was of, say, Zack Snyder as a choice.
Right.
So I think Gunn's got a better balance of, and I don't think of like serious and comedic. I think he's going to find the right tone. Like one of the mistakes I think DC made with Dark Knight. So it's like, ooh, dark. So now Superman's got to be dark, and this has got to be dark. And it's like, no. Dark Knight is dark. Superman is, optimistic or positive. The Flash is light, whatever. And I think Gunn is a better fit in helping each of them find the tone that fits that property. So, but anyway, I think it's too bad for Marvel, because I think they've lost one of their, main,
visionaries.
Yeah. And I mean, between really Gunn and the Russos were like doing the best stuff. And I don't know that the Russos are even coming back. Although I think I read that they were interested in Secret Wars. I wish the Russos had done the Fantastic Four. I would love to have seen their take on the FF. But hopefully they can lure the Russos back. But obviously they're not going to get James Gunn back because now he's, running the studio.
Right.
But so I mean, I think it's certainly good news for DC. Hopefully it doesn't turn out to be bad news for Marvel.
Right.
Hey, that's not it from Bart Mixon and myself. Next time, we are going to be discussing the interesting, if not curious, link between the Incredible Hulk and the iconic Universal monster Frankenstein. So be sure to check that out, bite that subscribe, and drop a comment down below if you like. On that note, I wish you all a wonderful week. Stay safe, stay happy, and most of all, stay alright.
Gaze into the abyss.